school leaders, it's that time. Let's look ahead and see what's going to happen this weekend. Remember, we are in the new unit. It's entitled Real Relationships. We're in session 2. It's called Forge True Friendship, out of 1 Samuel, various verses out of chapter 18, 19, and 20. And the point of the lesson is that strong friendships thrive because of shared commitment. This week we're going to look at a picture of true friendship. And let's remember the context now. We're in 1 Samuel, and we're in chapter 18. And in the previous chapter, in chapter 17, what has just happened? Well, David has just killed Goliath. We have to remember this is not King David. This is the shepherd boy. This is the peasant David. So that has just happened, okay? Now, in 1 Samuel 18, verse 1, it talks about Jonathan and David forging this new friendship, and it says they were one in spirit. You know, that's a phrase also that was used by Paul in Philippians 2:2, where Paul says, make my joy complete by having the same love, being in one spirit and of one mind. And I see that kind of relationship between Jonathan and David as we read through the text here. It says that he loved him as himself. And that word love there in Hebrew, yes, that can be used for a husband and wife relationship, but usually for other relationships as well. And out of our LifeWay leader material, you'll see that this was the same word that Ruth used for her mother-in-law, Naomi. It says she loved her. Also, the love also used a father for a son. So there's no indication here of a homosexual relationship. So just keep that in mind. That this is a story that is often used to support that there were homosexual relationships indicated in the Bible. So anyway, this is definitely not one of them. When I hear that phrase, loved him as himself, I think of the phrase that comes out of the Great Commandment. Remember, this is when Jesus basically boils down the law into 2 statements. And he says the first thing to do, the first law is, if you're going to boil it down, is to love God with all your being. And the second one is like it, is to love your neighbor as yourself. Love somebody else as yourself. We see that out of Matthew chapter 22, Mark chapter 12, and Luke chapter 10. But Paul also uses this as well. Over in Romans chapter 13 and Galatians chapter 5, he basically says the entire law can be summed up like this, in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. I mentioned this last week. If I truly loved others, I wouldn't steal, would I? I wouldn't steal their good name by slandering it. I wouldn't steal their intimacy with their spouse. I wouldn't steal stuff. Also in James chapter 2, verse 8, the love your neighbor as yourself is referred to as the royal law of Scripture. So let's go back to the Old Testament. Let's go back to 1 Samuel. We're down in verse 4. Jonathan gave his robe, his sword, these other things to David. Now, let's remember the context. David has just defeated the enemy, Goliath. Nobody else stepped up to do it. Jonathan realizes that David should be the next king and not him. In case you forgot, Jonathan is the king's son. And so naturally you would think that the king's son would be the next in line to be king. But Jonathan realizes that really David should be. I mean, he's actually an odd choice, isn't he? A peasant boy, nobody really knows him. But what Jonathan does here is a symbol. He gives David his military garb. He gives him his royal garb as a symbol to signify, I think you should be the next king. Now, this is true friendship, isn't it? Being happy for the success of your friends, especially when they outshine you. And it's easy to get jealous, isn't it, when your friends do just a little bit better than you or a lot better than you. Maybe that's one reason I don't like to go to high school reunions. I don't know. Anyway, so after this, Saul gets jealous. Saul gets jealous of David. You remember the people would shout as David would go through the streets that Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000. So they were ascribing more glory and more honor to David than to the king. And this really infuriated him. In between our story here, David marries one of Saul's daughters, Michal. And we get down to verse 19 in our next part of the text, verses 4 through 7. This is where a good friend goes to bat for you. Jonathan stood up to his dad, the king, but he did it in a tactful way, though. We get over to to chapter 20, verses 10 through 13, our last part of the scriptures that we're looking at. We see that Jonathan realizes David, his brother-in-law, his friend and his brother-in-law, is really going to be the next king. He also knows that Saul does not care for David at all. In fact, tries to kill him on several occasions. But Jonathan keeps his promise to David that he's going to warn him if his dad is coming out or is coming after him. And also we know later that David then keeps his promise to his friend Jonathan and cares for his Jonathan's ill son. Now this is a good story, and many in your class are going to be familiar with the whole story, not just these little bits and pieces that we've picked out here. But what are the takeaways? What are the takeaways that we can apply to our life from this lesson? Well, first of all, I think it's a true friendship endures. We talked last week out of Proverbs 17:17, how a friend loves at all times, right? Let's ask the question to the class, are you happy or jealous when your friends do well? Of course, this will be rhetorical. We don't want them to answer. Not only when they do well, but when they do better than you, especially then. Are we happy for them or jealous with them? Do we stick by our friends even when times are tough and the odds are against us, like Jonathan stuck by David, even when his dad was against David and actually was trying to kill him? And then a more pointed question as you start wrapping up the classes, is your Sunday school class a group of friends, or are they just a group of acquaintances? That's really where this hits, isn't it? Because I think in so many instances we have a group of acquaintances that meet together once a week, have a good time perhaps, but they're really not friends. And I know in our lives we can only handle so many friends, right? There's no way I can have 300 of my close and personal friends. I just can't handle that many relationships. But we need to be forging those true friendships in our church, in our Sunday school class especially. And when that happens, I think we'll see real community begin. All right, pray for your class. Have a great week. And I won't see you, but you'll see me next week.